Absolut, ska du klappa eller något?
Sure, det behövs inte.
Okay. So, you mentioned Foucault, which I know you have been talking a lot and writing a lot about.
Yeah, Foucault, I mean, he's... what should I say about Foucault is obviously one of the most cited and referred to and read and misread and maltreated and treated philosophers of the 20th century. I mean, I think he will be one of the most important figures when we look back on the 20th century. I mean, not just because he wrote important works, but also because he changed the idea what it means to do philosophy. I mean, normally you would think that philosophy works on problems of truth, ethics, logic, etc. There's a canon of texts, and you treat them, and you deal with classical thinkers, and you reread them and propose new solutions to all problems. Foucault really was an outsider in that context. He would read the history of psychiatry, medicine, criminal law. He would be engaged in so many things that were not properly philosophical, so he really expanded the scope of what philosophy could be. And when he was elected to the Collège de France in 1970, you get to name your own discipline. He didn't call it philosophy; he called it history of the systems of thought, like history of the system. So it's really different. Histoire de la système de pensée. So in that sense, he even didn't want to speak about philosophy. So was he a historian? Was he a philosopher? Was he a sociologist? We don't know. He was just inventing his own field, and I think that's the creativity that would be important. But I mean, I think if one would say, what is the true problem of Foucault? I mean, he wrote so much, and he didn't publish so many books, in fact. But here, as a matter of fact, we have here a lot of his lectures.
It's a lot of books.
Yeah, a lot of books. He was teaching at the Collège de France from 1970 to his death in '84. And he lectured on all kinds of things. And he lectured on ancient Greek, Roman texts, the church fathers, modern penal system, sexuality, all kinds of things. So he was always going where his problems led him. He had no preconceived idea of what philosophy would be and what it should treat. So in that sense, his open mind, I think, is a true source of inspiration. But I think if there's a problem in Foucault that he traces him, that you can trace throughout his work, and he does that himself, in fact, in one of the last texts he ever wrote, which was an unfinished preface to the second volume of his History of Sexuality, which was published just before he died in '84. He said that my true problem that has followed me from the start is what is experience? What is experience? And by experience, he does not simply mean, experience we think of having perceptions with a classical problem. What does it mean to perceive a thing? He means experience as something that constitutes and continually transforms the subject. From his early work, which was on psychiatry, to the last works on the history of sexuality and the rereading he proposed of ancient Greek texts, he always addressed the question, what does it mean to be a subject? What does it mean to relate to oneself? What does it mean to be someone and to be able to tell yourself, I am this person, this is my identity, this is what makes me into a person that thinks, knows, desires, feels, where is my place in the world? Mm-hmm. So a lot of people thought that, in early Foucault, specifically in the 60s, he was, what are you looking for? Glass, yeah. We can have some orange juice, maybe. He was engaged in overturning or somehow bracketing or getting away from the traditional senses of the subject. You find in Descartes and Kant and Husserl, the philosophical subject as a bearer of rationality. He wasn't so interested in that, but he wanted to get away from that sense of a universal subject and to understand the subject, as I said, as a kind of node in a series of historical systematic transformations, which is why he was perceived, I would say largely, if you read him, just the works from the 60s, as being opposed to the subject, the death of man, death of the subject, disappearance of the subject, which was a lot of stuff that was going on in French philosophy at the time. But what he was doing, he was trying to rethink the subject and say, if we think the subject as a historically changing entity, what does it mean then to have an experience of the subject? And this is why he was so interested in sexuality, in penal law, in psychiatry, and all those, how should I put it, all those margins where the subject is, to which the subject is exposed, and that also somehow transformed something.
Walle, why are you so fascinated by him? Or what is the area of what he's thinking about that you are most fascinated about?
But we would say end of his era, because he worked on psychiatry, all these things, and which I'm not an expert. I really don't have any knowledge in those fields. I mean, it's more his attitude. It's more his attitude towards, drawing things into philosophy that normally would be outside of philosophy, and saying that to be a philosopher means to engage with things that are not part of the academic discipline of philosophy. And I think this is a true source of inspiration. I mean, I work mainly on aesthetic theory, and I don't think his contributions to art theory, literary theory, aesthetics are that important. I mean, he has written interesting things on Magritte and other things, but they are mainly interesting because they throw a certain light, of course, I mean, on his other works. But in themselves, they are not, I wouldn't say, the book of Raymond Roussel, the book of Magritte, and his various writings of visual arts and literature. They're interesting, but they would not merit him. They would not merit him the place he has now in the history of philosophy. So yeah, it's the attitude of Foucault that I think is inspiring, and then also that he was always changing his mind. There's this great quote from the English architectural historian Rainer Bannon. He says something to the effect that in order to prove you have a mind, you have to change it. And Foucault changed his minds continually. Towards the end of his life, basically from 79 onward, he died in 84. He just rerouted his own work and went back to Greek antiquity, and he started reading the Church Fathers and Plato, and he produced a huge body of work on ancient philosophy, which is still, I think, not really appreciated to the extent that it needs to be. He really reorganized himself. So he was constantly changing himself, reorganizing himself, proving he had a mind by changing it all the time, which is also, I think, because normally you think of a philosopher as someone who has an idea, and then he sticks to it, and then he has to defend it all the time, even though he knows that this is completely hopeless. He still has to defend it, for reasons of prestige and everything else. I mean, the academic game that goes with that. Foucault was always changing it because he didn't care, and I think this is also a great source of inspiration.